So, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States becomes, at this point in time, in 1991, the world's sole remaining superpower. There's no other nation that can rival the military might and the networks that the United States have. And this creates a bit of a quandary for the United States because we're so used to having somebody opposite who our reactions to them largely drive our foreign policy. But now we are the most powerful nation on the globe. And that brings up the question of with this power comes great responsibility, to echo Uncle Ben from Spider Man. So, what are we going to do with this power? Will the United States become effectively the world's policeman because we are the only ones with this level of power? There is this desire at this time to use the influence of the United States to spread freedom and democracy as well as capitalism across the globe. And this wave of revolutionary change is not just unique to communist nations in the late 80s and 90s. We also start to see many nations in Africa and Latin America who had struggled with authoritarian regimes transitioning to democracies as well in the early 1990s. So there is this sense of the United States having a responsibility, right, to kind of mentor these younger democratic nations as they make these transitions. As to how we could best do that, there are two competing visions of American foreign policy proposed within Bush's own administration. So, those ideas are going to be proposed by General Colin Powell, who at this point in time was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Dick Cheney, who was George H.W. Bush's Secretary of Defense. They have two very different ideas on how the United States should conduct this new foreign policy. So let's talk about Powell's idea first. So for Powell, the collapse of the Soviet Union meant that international relations was about to get a lot more complicated. Now we're going to have a very unpredictable environment, right? Because we're not really kind of tracking, mapping one other nation. There's no other kind of counterweight to the United States. So Powell felt that this meant that conflicts were going to pop up fairly rapidly, fairly unpredictably in places that we maybe weren't keeping on our radar before. So, because of this, Powell said it's going to be difficult to allocate resources and respond to this, and we should act as part of a team. So, Powell's idea was the United States should not intervene in places without international cooperation and a clear exit strategy to keep us from overcommitting or getting stuck in places like we had in Vietnam. In contrast to that was Dick Cheney's plan. Cheney argued that this was a golden opportunity for the United States to exert our influence and our power unchallenged. He believed that America must be willing to use force to mold the world into our image and to maintain dominance. And that means that we should do that with or without international support. So for Colin Powell, the key ingredient here to avoid overextending is form relationships and coalitions with other nations and don't get involved unless there's a clear plan and a clear exit strategy. Whereas Cheney says, screw your plans, screw your international involvement. If it's important to maintaining our dominance, we're going to get involved and figure out the details later, and we'll be willing to go it alone. So you can see a little bit the influence of both Cheney and Powell and some of the first things that the United States is facing in Bush's time in office. In Panama, the deposed General Manuel Antonio Noriega, who was previously aligned with the United States, was brought to the U.S. after he was overthrown to be tried for drug trade charges in 1989. And then we see really Powell's approach shining in the Gulf War, which is one of the first post-Cold War interventions in the United States, or end Cold War intervention. So the Gulf War kicks off with Iraq invading its neighbor Kuwait. When Iraq invades Kuwait, which has oil fields as much as the Middle Eastern nations do, the United States led the United Nations to condemn the invasion. They argued that the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein had violated Kuwaiti sovereignty with this invasion. They also were afraid that Hussein would not stop with Kuwait and instead had his eyes on the far richer target of Saudi Arabia, okay, who were one of our allies at the time. And so, following the United Nations condemning this invasion, telling Hussein and Iraq to withdraw troops, which they did not, then the United States participated in an operation called Operation Desert Storm in 1991, which, working with the United Nations, different nations, coalitions of troops, we pushed the Iraqis out of Kuwait. This campaign was carried on for the most part with long distance cruise missiles and airstrikes, which meant death for tens of thousands of Iraqis, but a relatively minimal casualty count for United Nations troops. Less than 200 Americans died in this conflict. Now, this forced Iraq back out of Kuwait, and the terms of the peace after Operation Desert Storm was forcing Iraq to disarm and also imposing economic sanctions on them. However, the United Nations chose not to attempt to regime change or get rid of Saddam Hussein. And as a result of this conflict, the United States established a larger military presence in the Middle East, including in Saudi Arabia, who are one of the allies in this engagement. This is going to cause a few problems, not the least of which this sense that failing to remove Saddam Hussein is a bit of unfinished business that the younger Bush, George W. Bush, will attempt to address. But there's also the problem of American military in Saudi Arabia. Because Saudi Arabia is the home to two of the holiest sites in the religion of Islam, Mecca and Medina. And in fact, Mecca is considered a very important pilgrimage site for Muslims. As one of the 5 pillars of Islam, all Muslims must travel, if they can, at some point in their lives to Mecca to make a pilgrimage. And the fact that the United States was present in this nation, again, infuriates some more fundamentalist Muslims, like a gentleman named Osama bin Laden, who we will talk about not next session, but the one after.